The depot lunch window was locked with a red company seal. That was the first thing Mabel Cross saw when she stepped off the train at Cinder Fork, Wyoming. With one trunk, one carpet bag, and a marriage contract folded inside her glove. The second thing she saw was the plate. A blue enamel plate, chipped along the rim, set carefully on the wooden step beneath the locked window. It was empty. Not dropped. Not forgotten. Placed there like an accusation. 40 railroad workers stood around the depot platform in coats dusted pale from the grading line. Some held tin cups. Some leaned on shovels. One young man sat on an overturned crate with his head bowed over his knees. Too tired or too hungry to join the grumbling. Above the lunch window, a fresh notice snapped in the wind. Independent food vendors prohibited pending company review. Mabel read it twice. The words were official enough to sound reasonable and cruel enough to leave men hungry. A worker near the window kicked dust from his boot. If they won't feed us, they ought to stop asking us to move mountains. No one laughed. Mabel looked again at the empty blue plate. Most people would have seen hunger. She saw a line. Not a charity line. A customer line. The thought came so quickly she almost smiled. Which would have been improper for a woman standing alone at a depot waiting to meet the husband she had agreed to marry by letter. She pulled her glove tighter over the folded contract. Silas Ward was supposed to meet her here. Dry Bell Ranch. 12 hands. Kitchen work. Plain terms, marriage for stability. Not sentiment. He had written that much clearly. And Mabel had respected him for it. Men often hid hard bargains under soft words. Silas Ward had not. Still, nothing in his letters had mentioned a locked depot lunch window, 40 hungry railroad workers, or a plate that looked like a market waiting for someone brave enough to lift it. Mabel Cross. The voice came from behind her. She turned. Silas Ward stood beside a mud-splashed wagon. Hat in hand. Shoulders broad from work and face drawn from too little sleep. He was not old. But worry had put lines around his eyes before time had earned them. His coat was clean at the collar and worn thin at the cuffs. Mr. Ward. Silas. He said. If you still mean to come. It was not warm. It was honest. I came this far. His gaze flicked to her trunk. Then to the notice over the lunch window. Company trouble. Best not get near it. Mabel glanced at the men on the platform. They look hungry. Railroad men always look hungry. Do they always have money? That made him look at her properly for the first time. She held his gaze. He did not answer. The ride to Dry Bell Ranch took nearly 2 hours. The road cut through pale grass and low, wind-flattened scrub. Mabel watched everything. Thin cattle along a fence line. A barn roof patched in 3 different shades of wood. A dry creek bed with wagon ruts in the mud where water should have been. Men in the distance moving slowly. Not lazy. Just worn down to the bone by too many seasons of almost enough. Silas spoke little. That suited her. Silence left room for counting. By the time the ranch house came into view, Mabel had counted 6 sagging fence sections. 2 lame horses. 1 underfilled hay shed. And no sign of spare money anywhere. The house itself was large enough to promise better days and tired enough to prove those days had passed. Smoke came from the kitchen stovepipe. Weak smoke. The kind made by a stove that had been used without love or strategy. Silas lifted her trunk down. 12 hands eat at dawn. Noon. And dusk. He said. Beans mostly. Salt pork when we can spare it. Coffee, if it can still be called coffee. I see. The men are rough. Not wicked. They won't thank you. I did not come west for applause. Something moved in his face. Not a smile. The beginning of one. Maybe. Inside, the kitchen was bigger than she expected, and worse kept than she feared. Flour stored badly. Coffee stale. Grease unstrained. Shelves cluttered with chipped bowls and wasted corners. On one shelf, Mabel set the blue enamel plate. Silas noticed. Where did that come from? The depot. You brought a stranger's plate. No. Mabel said, looking around the kitchen that everyone thought was her whole future. I brought a question. He frowned. What question? Mabel touched the rim of the plate. How many hungry men does it take before supper becomes a business? Down. Mabel had learned the kitchen's first problem was not hunger. It was waste. Flour sat in a half-open barrel where mice had found the seam. Coffee beans had gone stale in a cloth sack because no one had tied it properly. Salt pork lay under a loose lid, sweating in its own brine. A sack of dried apples had been shoved behind a crate of onions, forgotten long enough that half the slices had darkened past saving. She did not curse. Cursing did not restore a pantry. She rolled up her sleeves, found a scrap of slate, and began writing. Flour lost. Coffee salvageable. Apples half good. Grease strained. Beans soaked too long. By the time the first hand came through the door, Mabel had the stove hot. Coffee roasting low in a pan to bring back some life. And biscuit dough cut clean on the table. The man stopped on the threshold. He was lean, gray-bearded, and bent slightly to one side from an old injury. His eyes went to the blue enamel plate on the shelf. Boss bought you a decoration? He asked. No. Mabel said. I borrowed a reminder. He grunted. Name's Orrin. Mabel. I know. Whole bunkhouse knows. Then the bunkhouse can wash before breakfast. Orrin stared at her. Then, to her surprise, he laughed once and went back outside. The men came in rough and suspicious. 12 of them crowded along the long table. Jonah Pike was the loudest, with shoulders like a gatepost and a grin that expected others to follow. Well, he said, looking at the biscuits. The new Mrs. Ward means to civilize us. I mean to feed you. Mabel said. Civilizing costs extra. Ben Roque, the youngest, tried to hide a smile behind his cup. Silas stood near the doorway, watching, not helping, not interfering. Mabel counted that in his favor. She served breakfast fast. Biscuit. Fried eggs stretched with chopped onion. Beans warmed properly. Coffee dark enough to stand on its own. The table quieted after the first bites. Not polite quiet. Working quiet. The kind made by men deciding hunger mattered more than pride. Jonah Pike ate 3 biscuits and did not praise a single one. But he scraped his plate clean with the last edge. And Mabel saw it. She saw everything. After breakfast, the men filed out. Ben lingered to carry the wash water without being asked. Orrin stacked plates. Silas waited until the room emptied. That was good, he said. It was measured. His brow creased. Measured. Mabel turned the slate toward him. Cost per man. Waste recovered. Time served. How long they sat. How much was left? Silas looked at the figures as if she had written them in another language. You kept numbers on breakfast. I keep numbers on anything that can save or sink a household. This is a ranch, not a boarding house. It is both if men sleep here and eat here. He looked toward the blue plate. This is about the depot. It is about the depot. The railroad crews. Your thin cattle. Your unpaid bank note. And the fact that you have beef nobody is buying at a fair price, while 40 men 10 miles away are hungry enough to leave a plate like a prayer on a step. His face closed a little. There it was. Not anger. Fear wearing a work coat. You are talking about hauling food to grading camps. I am talking about testing whether they will pay. The company sealed that window for a reason. The company sealed its own window. It did not seal my stove. Mabel. It was the first time he said her name like something he was trying to hold back. The men already think this arrangement is strange. He said. A wife from a contract. A kitchen, they do not know. If you drive out there selling plates, they will laugh. They laughed this morning before they ate. That is different. No. She said. It is the same. Men laugh while they are waiting to see whether something works. Silas looked down at the slate again. What do you want? One day. One wagon. Ben to drive. Enough beef scraps for stew. Flour for biscuits. Apples for hand pies. I will price low for the first 12 plates and record whether the men come back. If it fails, we lose one day's food, and I will write that honestly. And if it succeeds, then this kitchen stops being only a room where money disappears. Silas was silent for a long time. Outside, a horse struck the rail. Somewhere in the yard, Jonah Pike called for a cinch strap. Work was waiting. And so was Ryan. Mabel could feel both pressing against the walls. Finally, Silas reached into his pocket and set a key on the table. The smokehouse, he said. Mabel looked at the key. Then at him. If we fail, he added. We fail with exact numbers. That was not trust yet. But it was a door. Mabel picked up the key. Then I will need the wagon after tomorrow's breakfast, she said. And clean cloth. Food sold from a dirty wagon tastes cheaper. For the first time, Silas Ward almost smiled. I married a cook, he said quietly. No, Mabel said, turning back toward the stove. You married a woman who can count plates. The wagon smelled like beef. Apples. Smoke. And risk. Mabel stood in the back. One hand braced against the sideboard as Ben Rook guided the team over rutted ground toward the grading camp. Behind them, Dry Bell Ranch shrank into the morning haze. Ahead, the railroad cut lay like a fresh wound across the prairie. Full of men. Shovels. Picks. Mules. And the hard clang of steel against stone. Ben glanced back for the third time. You nervous? Mrs. Ward. Yes. He blinked. You admit it. Nerves are information. Panic is waste. He considered that. Then nodded as if storing it away. In the wagon bed, Mabel had packed 2 kettles of beef stew wrapped in wool to hold the heat. Biscuits under clean cloth. And apple hand pies stacked in tins. On top of the crate sat the blue enamel plate. Not for serving. For remembering. At the edge of the camp, a foreman with a square beard and suspicious eyes walked toward them. His name was Mr. Dieter. According to Ben. And he had already turned away 3 traveling peddlers that month. No vendors. Dieter called before the wagon stopped. Company order. Mabel climbed down carefully, smoothing her apron. I am not asking for your men's wages on company time, she said. I am asking for 12 minutes of your noon break. His eyes narrowed. For what? A test. Dieter folded his arms. Mabel lifted the blue plate from the crate and held it up. 12 plates at half price. Stew. 2 biscuits. 1 hand pie. If your men do not return to shift faster and steadier than they do after cold beans, I will not come back tomorrow. A few workers had begun drifting closer. Dieter looked past her to the wagon. The smell had already done half the argument. And if they like it, then tomorrow you buy a block of 40 plates at a fair rate. And I write down the time served. Time returned. And number fed. You initial it. No guesswork. You keeping books on supper. I am keeping books on lost work. That got him. Dieter stared at her for a long moment. Then gave one sharp nod. 12 plates. The line formed before he finished speaking. Mabel served fast. Ben took coins. Repeated orders. And marked plates on the slate. The men ate standing. Sitting on rail ties. Crouched beside tools. Some closed their eyes at the first bite. One older worker held a hand pie in both hands, as if it might disappear. No one joked. Hunger was honest when food finally met it. After 12 plates. Mabel covered the kettle. The 13th man groaned. Lady. You got a cruel streak. No. She said. I have an agreement. Dieter watched his crew. At the bell call. The 12 who had eaten rose quicker than the others. They moved back to the cut without dragging their feet. Without quarrel. Without the usual slow scattering that made foremen shout themselves hoarse. Mabel did not smile. She wrote. Camp 1. 12 plates. Served in 11 minutes. Return to shift. 6 minutes faster than cold meal line. Per foreman observation. She turned the slate to Dieter. Initial here. He did. Then he said. 40, tomorrow. By the third day. 40 was not enough. By the fifth. Men from the second camp walked nearly a mile to reach the wagon. By the end of the week. Mabel had added a second kettle and Ben had stopped looking nervous. He handled the cigar tin with fierce attention. Made change quickly. And corrected one man who tried to claim he had paid twice. You didn't. Ben said. Mrs. Ward counts better than hunger talks. The man paid. At Dry Bell. The kitchen changed first. Orrin Vale discovered that his bad back hated saddle work, but tolerated biscuit dough if the table was raised on blocks. Lottie Crane. A widow from Cinder Fork. Came to bake pies and stayed because Mabel paid by the dozen and wrote the total where everyone could see it. June Pike arrived with 3 children. 2 aprons. And a peach preserve recipe that made Ben stare into space after one bite. The ranch began waking before dawn with purpose. Not desperation. Purpose. Route times went on a slate by the door. Beef cuts were planned instead of wasted. Coffee was ordered by the sack. Sealed properly. And stretched across camp schedules. The men stopped calling it Mrs. Ward's scheme. They called it the route. One evening, a railroad timekeeper came to Dry Bell and asked Silas, who owned the food wagon. Silas looked toward the kitchen, where Mabel was bent over the meal mile slate with flour on her sleeve and pencil behind her ear. I supply the beef, he said. Mrs. Ward built the route. Mabel heard him. She did not look up. But the pencil paused in her hand. Just long enough for the words to settle somewhere no ledger could hold. Mercer Quill arrived in a black coach with polished brass lamps and wheels too clean for a man who claimed to understand prairie work. Mabel saw the coach from the kitchen window and knew trouble had learned to dress well. The Dry Bell yard had never been so busy. Ben was loading the south wagon. Orrin was wrapping biscuits in clean cloth. Lottie Crane stood at the long table cutting pies into even rows. While June Pike tied paper packets with twine and called numbers to Mabel from the route slate. Camp 1. 40 plates. Camp 2. 36. Camp 3. Trial order. 24. The kitchen had become a clock. And every hand in it knew where to move. Then the coach stopped. Silas came in from the barn. Wiping his hands on a rag. His eyes went to the coach. Then to Mabel. Railroad man, he said. Not a hungry one. Mabel answered. Mercer Quill stepped down. brushed dust from one sleeve, and looked at Dry Bell Ranch as if it were an inconvenient shed built too near his railroad. "Mrs. Ward," he said, when Mabel came onto the porch. "Mercer Quill. Continental Spore Company. Regional Contracts. I know who you are." His smile did not warm. "Then I hope that saves time." Silas stood beside her. Not in front. Quill noticed. Men like him always noticed placement. "You have been feeding our grading crews," Quill said. "Doing it efficiently." "I'm told. Too efficiently. Perhaps. Hungry men eat fast. And fed men work faster." Quill removed his gloves finger by finger. "That is precisely the problem." Mabel said nothing. He pulled a folded paper from his coat and laid it on the porch rail. "A buyout. Fair enough for a woman who began with no formal contract. You will sell your wagons, route records, recipes, and camp arrangements to Continental Spur. In return, you will receive a sum that should help your husband's ranch survive the season." Silas's jaw tightened. Mabel picked up the paper. The number was insulting. The clause beneath it was worse. "You want me to agree not to serve any railroad crew for 5 years. Standard protection." "No," Mabel said. "That is a gag tied with ribbon." Quill's eyes sharpened. "You have goodwill, Mrs. Ward. I have Gates. Do not mistake one for the other." He placed his hat back on his head. "By tomorrow morning, no independent vendor will be allowed inside Continental Spur work camps. Your wagons will turn around full. Your cooks will still require wages. Food spoils quickly in heat." He glanced toward the kitchen, where Lottie and June had gone still. "I advise sense." After he left, the yard did not move for several seconds. Then Ben whispered, "Can he do that?" Mabel looked toward the rail line. "Yes." The next morning, he did. Camp 1's gate was closed. Dieter met the wagon outside the rope line, hat in hand, shame written deep in his face. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Ward. My job's tied to that order." Mabel looked past him. Workers stood behind the line, watching the wagon with the kind of quiet that hurt worse than complaint. By noon, all 3 camps had closed. By sunset, Dry Bell had 2 wagons of food unsold, 5 workers to pay, and a kitchen full of pie cooling into loss. Silas found Mabel at the root slate after dark. She had not erased the day's numbers. She had written them in full. Food prepared. Food refused. Wages owed. Loss counted. "We could take the offer," Silas said carefully. Mabel did not turn. It would clear part of the bank note and kill the thing that could pay all of it. He was silent. She heard him breathing, steady and close. "I know what you risked," she said. "Smokehouse, beef, wagon, men's respect, maybe the ranch. Our risk," he said. That made her turn. Silas looked tired, but not doubtful. "What number do we need to prove?" he asked. For a moment, the closed gates, the spoiled food, and Quill's polished smile all fell away. Mabel pulled a newspaper clipping from beneath the slate. "The Prairie and North Line is grading 40 miles south. They are racing Continental Spur for the same pass." Silas read the notice. Then he looked up. Mabel tapped the root slate. "Quill thinks he owns the hungry men. He forgot he does not own hunger." Silas leaned over the table. This time, when she began the arithmetic, he picked up the pencil beside her. The Prairie and North Survey Office stood 40 miles south, in a town that looked less built than hammered together by urgency. Mabel arrived with dust in her hair. a route slate wrapped in oilcloth, and the blue enamel plate packed in a flour sack beside the meal mile ledger. Silas rode with her. But he did not carry the papers. He had offered once. She had shaken her head. They need to see whose hand built the numbers, she said. So he carried only the flour scale weight. Because the wind that morning was mean enough to steal paper from a table. The office was crowded with men arguing over maps, supply manifests, grading delays, mule teams, and timber orders. Nobody looked eager to hear from a ranch wife with a plate in a sack. A clerk tried to stop her at the door. Provisioning appointments are scheduled through the regional desk. Mabel set the blue enamel plate on his counter. I am the appointment your hungry crews do not know they need yet. The clerk stared. A woman's voice came from the back room. Let her through. Mrs. Almagreer was not what Mabel expected from a railroad provisioning agent. She wore a plain gray traveling suit, kept her hair pinned tight, and had eyes that looked as if they had measured every excuse a man could make, and found most of them short. You have 5 minutes, Mrs. Greer said. I will need 12. You have 6. Mabel placed the route slate on the table. Then the meal mile ledger. Then the blue plate. Lust. Silas set down the flour scale weight to hold the pages open. Mrs. Greer's eyes moved to it. That is not railroad equipment. No. Mabel said. It is kitchen equipment. Today it holds railroad numbers. That earned the smallest lift of Mrs. Greer's brow. Mabel began. She did not talk about stew first. Or biscuit. Or handpiece. Men already dismissed food if a woman spoke too warmly of it. She spoke of minutes. Camp 1 before meal route. Late return from noon break. Quarrels at water barrels. Reduced afternoon output. Camp 1 after hot meals. Men served in under 12 minutes. Return to shift faster. Fewer foreman delays. Camp 2. Similar results. Camp 3. Trial orders showed the same pattern. She pointed to foreman initials. Shift times. Plates served. Waste saved. Beef supplied locally. Flour bought in bulk. Drivers on fixed routes. Cost per plate against cost of lost work. Mrs. Greer stopped her halfway through. Who wrote these observations? I did. Who verified them? Foreman Dieter. Walsh. And Minden. Their initials are beside each camp. And Continental Spur cut you off. Yes. Why? Because I had no contract and too much value. The room went quiet enough that the map men stopped arguing. Mrs. Greer leaned back. That is a dangerous sentence. It is an accurate one. Silas stood at Mabel's left shoulder. Silent. Mrs. Greer looked at him. And you? Mr. Ward. You are here as husband or owner. Silas's face did not change. Beef supplier. Wagon builder. Witness, if asked. Not the operator. Mabel did not look at him. But she felt the words settle warmly between her ribs. Mrs. Greer turned back to the ledger. You are asking for what? 10-day trial. 3 camps. Entry rights for our wagons. Payment per plate. Adjusted for distance. Foreman initials required daily. If the numbers hold. Exclusive meal route for your western grading crews. And if they do not hold. Then you owe me nothing beyond food served. Mrs. Greer studied her for a long moment. Then she pushed the ledger toward one of the clerks. Check the arithmetic. The man did. Twice. His expression changed by the second pass. Mrs. Greer smiled then. Not kindly. But with recognition. I have spent 2 years telling head office hungry men lay slow track. She said. They called it domestic concern. Mabel touched the blue plate. Then let us make it a railroad concern. Mrs. Greer opened a drawer and took out a small red ticket punch. She clipped 3 blank camp passes and slid them across the table. 10 days. She said. 3 camps. If your meal mile numbers hold, we write the full contract. Mabel picked up the passes. They were not a rescue. They were a door. Outside. The southern wind hit hard. But this time Mabel did not feel it push her back. Silas walked beside her to the wagon. You did it, he said. No, Mabel answered, holding the red punched passes tight. Now I have to prove it again with supper. The 10-day trial did not win because the stew was good. It won because the numbers held. By the 3rd day, Prairie and North Foreman were signing the meal mile sheets before the kettles were empty. By the 6th, one camp asked for breakfast as well as noon plates. By the 9th, Mrs. Alma Greer arrived herself, stood beside the route slate, and watched men return to their grading lines faster than her own head office had ever believed possible. On the 10th evening, she came to Dry Bell Ranch with the full contract in a leather folder. Not a promise. Not goodwill. A contract. Mabel spread it on the long kitchen table. The same table where the hands had once eaten beans in tired silence. The same table where Silas had first stared at her slate, as if breakfast could not possibly have arithmetic inside it. Now everyone stood around it. Silas. Ben. Orrin. Lottie Crane. June Pike with her 3 children pressed close to her skirt. Jonah Pike near the door, hat in his hands. Mrs. Greer placed the pen beside Mabel. Prairie and North grants Dry Bell exclusive meal rights for Western grading crews. She said. Renewable by output and delivery record. Mabel read every line. Then she looked at Silas. He did not reach for the pen first. He only nodded toward it. Built by your hand, he said. Mabel signed. Mabel Cross Ward. Then she slid the pen to Silas. He signed beneath her. Not above. Within 6 weeks. The banknote was paid early. Silas rode home from Cinder Fork with the receipt folded in his vest pocket. He did not wave it around the yard. He walked into the kitchen, placed it under the flour scale weight beside the blue enamel plate, and looked at Mabel with eyes that had learned how to hope again. Debt cleared, he said. Mabel touched the receipt. Then we decide what the money becomes next. It became a proper brick oven for Orrin, high enough that his back no longer bent over a camp stove. It became wages and plate bonuses written clearly for Lottie and June. It became 2 more wagons, 3 more drivers, bulk flour orders, a repaired barn roof, and cattle strong enough to make Dry Bell a ranch again instead of a place waiting to fail. But Mabel did not let the business become only Silas Ward's ranch account. She wrote a charter. Dry Bell Meal Cooperative. Silas held the beef supply share. Mabel held the operating share. Ben received driver bonus rights. Orrin, Lottie, and June received wages plus plate shares. Every new cook would receive a written copy of her terms before touching a stove. Jonah Pike read the charter slowly, lips moving over the words. Then he looked at Mabel. You mean even kitchen work gets shares? Mabel looked at the blue plate on the shelf. Especially kitchen work. By autumn, the old depot lunch window at Cinder Fork opened again. Not under Continental Spur's seal. Not under Mercer Quill's permission. Under a painted sign, Mabel hung herself. Hot meals sold here by contract. Not permission. Quill never came back to Dry Bell. Word traveled that Continental Spur moved him east after Prairie and North crews began outpacing his line. But the real consequence came a month later, when Continental Spur posted a new notice at 3 camps. Provisioning bids open to independent operators with written terms and delivery records. Dieter, the old foreman from Camp 1, came to the window that same week with a work order in his hand. Company says I can buy again, he said. Mabel looked at the order. Then at the blue plate hanging on the wall. Then this time, she said, we write it before anyone eats. He signed. So did she. That was the difference between permission and standing. On the first cold evening of winter, Silas found her in the office, setting the flour scale weight beside the blue enamel plate. I used to weigh cattle, he said. You taught me to weigh chances. Mabel glanced at him. Then keep the scale level. He took the paid bank receipt from his vest and pinned it beside the cooperative charter. Then he stepped back. Your name first, he said. Every board. Every contract. Every route sheet. Mabel looked at him for a long moment. That is not gratitude, she said. No, Silas answered. It is accuracy. Outside, smoke rose from the kitchen chimney. But it was not the thin smoke of a house feeding 12 tired men and losing money with every meal. It was steady smoke. Rich with bread, beef, coffee, and work that had finally been named. A woman came to the depot window near dusk. A widow with flour on her sleeves and worry in her eyes. I heard you might need help, she said. I can cook. Mabel reached for the route slate and turned it toward her. Can you count plates honestly? The woman blinked. Then she nodded. Mabel opened the cooperative ledger to a fresh page. Then let's write your terms before the stove gets hot. She wrote the woman's name first. Then the wage. Then the plate share. Then one final line at the bottom of the page. No work that feeds the line shall go unnamed or unpaid. Mabel signed beneath it. Mabel Cross Ward, operating partner. Behind her, the blue enamel plate hung on the wall. It was not empty anymore. And Mabel Cross Ward, once brought West to cook, had built a table wide enough for everyone's work to count. This is a fictional story created for educational and entertainment purposes. All characters, events, places, and situations are imaginary. Any resemblance to real people, living or dead, or real events is purely coincidental.